all joined today. My name is Chris Naive, and I am at the Mulvaney Center for Community Awareness and Social Action at the University of San Diego. And I also serve on the board for IRSlice. And like you, I am really looking forward to learning from our colleagues today in what will be a two-part webinar. First, just want to say thank you to IRSlice's Special Programming Committee for organizing this event. With special appreciation for the planning team, Rachayida Shah from the Bonner Network, Laura Martin from the University of Mississippi, and also who will be a featured panelist, Susan Harris from the University of Southern California, Amber Cameron from the University of Minnesota, and Star Plaxton Moore from the University of San Francisco. And also want to thank the newest member to the IRSlice family, Tiana Nobile, who started as our administrative director for IRSlice this past July. And as Star mentioned, just a reminder to please stay on mute, but feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, ask questions, cheer, and send all kinds of heart and positive emojis. So just a bit of framing. On behalf of IRSlice and the board, we're just really grateful to be hosting this webinar. It's really great to see many IRSlice members, current and past board members. And if you're not a member or have not yet renewed, I do encourage you to do so. So you can continue to be part of a really diverse network of scholars from across disciplines and around the world, committed to publicly engaged scholarship and agenda setting work, which will also gain you access to publications and programs such as today. You all would have access to the Graduate Student Network, or GradSN, open to all emerging scholars committed to SLICE, which also includes, by the way, the Graduate Student Network, or GradSN, open to all emerging scholars committed to SLICE, which also includes, such as our very own panelist, Dr. Distilio, and many of you who are part of GradSN. And you can even be featured in the dissertation dish, which is a new partnership between IRSlice, Imagining America, and Lead California, and featuring some of the most cutting edge and recent SLICE dissertations. Again, my apologies with the choppy internet here. I'll keep doing my best. Otherwise, I'll have to call in so I don't disrupt the flow. A couple more plugs, and then I would like to introduce the panelists. Another benefit of being part of IRSlice is you could be part of the practitioner scholar community, being led by past IRSlice board chair and current IRSlice scholar in residence, Dr. Patrick Green at Loyola University in Chicago. The PSC gives participants a chance to explore what it means to be a community engagement professional, while also providing participants a chance to explore their scholarship agenda with the hope of providing a pathway for SLICE publication. So with that being said, just a little overview of the session, and again, welcome today. This is part of a two-day webinar with a focus on self-reflection and collective empowerment through the lens of the community-engaged professional competency model described in the book From Campus Compact, the Community Engagement Professional in Higher Education, and published by our friends at Stylus in 2017. I believe there's a link in the chat, or you're seeing the slide there, as well as the framework. And I just did want to read an acknowledgement by Dean Tim Eatman at Rutgers. And he wrote, and he said that this book illuminates important work of thinly acknowledged citizens of academe, community engaged professionals. It advances the movement for publicly engaged scholarship, giving voice to their person, place, and purpose in academe, with myriad inflections beyond campus borders. Couched in a conceptually rich analysis of the professions, the authors demonstrate the multidimensionality and complexity of this rising class and their critical place in the university of the 21st century. You can hear Tim saying that very much in his own words. So at this point, I would like to invite all of you to introduce yourselves on the chat and include why this topic resonates with you. And there were many colleagues who contributed to the book, and we're fortunate to have one of the co-editors and two of the contributors to share their reflections and wisdom today. We have Dr. Lena Distilio, Vice Chancellor of Engagement and Community Affairs, where she sets and advances the University of Pittsburgh's community engagement agenda and catalyzes efforts across the university, including place-based engagement, engaged scholarship, strategic partnership development, and community affairs. Dr. Destilio is also a faculty member within the Department of Educational Foundations, Organizations, and Policy in the School of Education. Her research explores the community engagement professional in higher education and hyperlocal place-based engagement, and past Irish Slice board member and member of Grad SN. We also have Dr. Laura Martin, who is the Associate Director of the Grisham McLean Institute for Public Service and Community Engagement, a center at the University of Mississippi that fights poverty through education, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Laura engages faculty, staff, students, and community partners in mutually beneficial efforts to improve quality of life in Mississippi. She directs M-Partner, a university-wide community engagement initiative that aligns community priorities with university resources and guides implementation of the North Mississippi Vista Project, a national service program focused on poverty alleviation, capacity building, sustainable solutions, and community empowerment. And we also have Dr. Tate Kellogg. She's the founder of the Evaluation Coach, a new way to support data strategy. She spends her days coaching teams around why data is valuable, how to identify their program strategy, how to measure their outcomes, and how to learn to tell their story of their program through a step-by-step group coaching process. Tate's previous roles include Director of Research for the applied research consulting firm Higher Ed Insight, Evaluation Consultant for the Center for Public Service at Tulane University, and the administrative home of Irish Slice, by the way, and data analyst for the Woodward Hines Education Foundation. So thank you all for being here. And without further ado, I'd like to invite my friend and colleague, Dr. Lena Destilio, to the virtual mic.
Thank you so very much, Chris. I am so excited to be with everybody today. I have to say, I'm particularly intrigued by the introductions that are going on in the chat. So please, as we get this started, continue to put those in. We're interested in who you are and where you're coming from and why you want to attend the webinar today. We'd love to continue to hear from everybody in the audience. As Chris said, I'm Lena Destilio, and I had such a fabulous experience back in 2015, 2016, when I got to work with this amazing group of research fellows. And it was, as we were preparing for today's webinar, Tate and Laura and I were chit-chatting about that experience, and we would meet weekly. And there were, I think, gosh, if I'm not mistaken, 17 of us across the country, and all of whom were really brought into this idea of hammering out what's the knowledge and skill and practice and belief system and ethical set of commitments that we hold in common, because we're such the breadth of us is enormous. But we had this really intriguing opportunity to come together and find out what was common. And so we would get together every week, and it was probably the most rewarding writing experience I had ever had. The flow of ideas and the depth of combing into not just the literature, but into the practice that we were observing in our own work and within our institutions was, it was catalytic for me, to be frank. I think that's true. It was very catalytic. And so the body of work is one that I'm so proud of because it was collective work, much like the rest of our community engaged practice. And I think it propelled my own practice to much deeper levels. So I have the wonderful job of sharing with you a little bit about the actual competency framework, right? What is it? What was it meant to be? And maybe where does it stand today? And then to pass this off to my colleagues to share some of their experiences as well. So at the basic level, what we were trying to do was call attention to the idea that there are these people within universities and colleges that maybe not the direct actors of community engaged work. In other words, maybe we're not the ones that are either considered a community partner or an engaged scholar or a civically oriented student, right? But we're the people who are helping to facilitate and influence and guide and agitate and institutionalize. And I posited that we needed to pay attention to this group of us because we had an outsized influence on how the work then got rooted at an institution. So if you're really connected to a certain tradition of practice and a way of thinking about community engaged work in higher education, you likely are going to guide your colleagues, partners, to do that similarly. But without having any kind of shared preparation, without understanding exactly what it is that we have in common, the breadth can potentially be confusing, right? So we wanted to get to the commonalities. And so we posited that we wanted to create this naming shift between practitioners, right? We looked across the literature, we looked across the bodies of practice. We said sometimes we're called coordinators, directors, staff, facilitators, lots and lots and lots of words for us. And we thought, well, we're kind of practitioners. However, there are many of us who come from community-based spaces that would use that word to signal something outside of the academy. So that one didn't feel quite right to us. And as we started to build together, we thought, what about professionals? And professionals is an interesting word because it's a little controversial. But we had a particular set of resources that we were drawing from. And professional actually means that you have four things in common. That you have a body of practice and knowledge that you share. That it's distinct. That body of practice and knowledge is distinct from how others would come to that work and maybe the roles that they play. The second thing is that there are practice scholar communities, right? So you actually have people with whom you associate, right? Sometimes we find those in our professional associations, disciplinary associations, that you have reference points with. The third is that you have an identity, right? You recognize each other. It's not like you meet each other and you're sort of like, oh, that's how you talk about yourself too, but instead you kind of get each other, right? You say, oh, you do a certain kind of thing on your campus and I kind of do something similar on mine. And the fourth, and very importantly, there's a shared set of ethical commitments. And for our work, we found that had a lot to do with critical commitments, really thinking through equity, the democratic purpose of higher education, the civic notion of responsibility. And so together, those four things created this sort of identity for us. And we wanted to shift that into that idea of professional. And I wanted to read one piece from the book. It's on page 9. The picture of the community engagement profession that we have painted here is one that is highly reflective, hybridized, purpose-driven, and ethically principled. It rejects a narrow framing of specialized knowledge coming from one singular preparation pathway. Our understanding of profession is socially constructed and collaboratively developed. It's a collaboratively developed set of understandings and commitments. It would reject paths of development that are only didactic and do not facilitate reflection on practice and mentorship of varying kinds. In other words, we were really clearly staking out that our idea of a community engagement professional was very, very reflective of how we do our work. And so it took us the better part of a year to dive into the literature and in almost every area of our work that you could imagine, whether that was working with students or working with faculty or creating partnerships or institutionalizing the work, or even administrative tasks. We always asked, what's the body of knowledge and practice that you need to do this? What are the ethical commitments that are threaded throughout this? What are the referent scholar practice communities? And then finally, how do you put these together in such a way that we could go out and ask people that held these roles at other campuses if we had gotten it right, if it needed to be refined, if it was current with their practice? And so that was the research. And from that came a competency model. And I'm pleased to say it has been expanded and contested and pushed and pulled. It's showing up in dissertations. There was an entire special issue of the Journal for Higher Education Outreach and Engagement on it. There was a subsequent guidebook that got written. But most importantly to me, and this is the last thing that I wanted to offer, most importantly, it really underscored that we have an identity and we have a role. And I always joke, sometimes we just need to make a t-shirt and say, no, it's a thing, right? Community engagement professionals are real. And we have a really big part to play in how this work enlivens higher education now and in the future. So I'm delighted to get the webinar started and excited to pass this on to my colleagues. We wanted to get some reflections from Laura and Tate. They'll introduce themselves as well and dive into our conversation today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lena. It is always a pleasure. I'm sure you all agree to hear Lena talk about her work and her passion when it comes to this community. It's a thing. I like that. It was also that inspiring every time we met all those years ago to have her lead the ship on this front. So with her thoughtful leadership, hopefully you can hear the rock band that just started playing right outside my window and it's not too distracting for everybody. So Laura and I just wanted to show up and say a minute about what the process was like for in our experience. So we were both doctoral students at the time. So I think I was in my second year at Tulane University as a PhD student in the City Culture and Community program. And I'll speak a little bit about my experience with this later, but in the actual process, where we started was in this really thoughtful review of the literature. And our perspective that Lena kind of tasked us with was this point that there had been a lot written about community engagement in higher education, but not, almost nothing written about the people behind that. And it's really fascinating when you really think through that lens and start reading about institutions, how the people are often missing. So we're just like, Tulane University structures things this way, and we're not, thinking like, okay, but what is a university? It's made up of the people, right? The people behind it that are making decisions and coming together and putting the work every day into this. So I read in my chapter that I wrote about institutionalizing community engagement. And if you read it, you see a little bit about how we did, the approach of the literature review and what we looked for. But the big point was just to read things about institutions and ask ourselves, okay, if this comes to be, what are the knowledge, attributes, skills that are required to make something like this happen, whatever this is. And we had 6 teams as a starting place, and another chapter emerged along the process. So we thought about faculty. We had a faculty team, a team about partnerships, a team about program administration, student development, institutionalizing community engagement on campus. That was the team that I was on, and then leading change within higher education. So those were really the big buckets that had been written extensively within this literature. And each of our teams went out and, really combed through to think through what it was that the competencies that were necessary for community engagement professionals to successfully implement each aspect of this. We made a long list of competencies, and then of course Lena was leading this second stage of the work, but there was a pilot survey of about 50 where everybody who was involved ranked these competencies by their importance, so on a scale from 0 to 100. And that first round eliminated a handful that had emerged from the literature as maybe not being centrally important. And then with the leadership of Lena, she sent this survey across Campus Compact with that same list of competencies, the whittled down version. And there were 414 responses to that survey. And it was the same idea where there was some open-ended response and some demographic data about this community, the community engagement professionals, but mostly it was, what do you think is most important? How much do you use this in your everyday work with each of these competencies that were laid out? Laura, anything you would add to that process?
Yeah, sure. Tate, that was very thorough. Thank you so much for giving the recap. And I really just wanted to open with gratitude for all of you guys for being here, for IR Slice, for creating this opportunity and creating what has been a really powerful series of opportunities during the pandemic to foster these connections, as we have been so isolated and transformed by many crises unfolding simultaneously. And I mean, I think where I can kind of overlay Tate's reflections is that this was a really powerful learning experience. This, for me, happened when I was about 10 years into my career, having worked in international community development, national service in the United States, and then legislative advocacy before coming to higher education. And I had made kind of an impulsive decision to work on my doctorate. And I don't know that I even shared with the research team that I became a part of this the semester before I officially started as a doc student. And so, you know, when we study models of service learning, we think about having an opportunity to apply classroom knowledge in the field. And for me, in so many ways, being a part of this highly structured literature review experience was a way to do just that. The tools, and it was didactic and collaborative. The tools that we shared, that Lena shared with us, the literature review matrix that Sean Crosland and I worked on extensively, became a model for how I have started to train students when they work on their undergraduate theses and when they are doing literature reviews. And so the timing for me was a gift, because I felt that I was able to have a really powerful academic, but then also scholarly and applied experience before I had really even started my doctoral program, which was incredible. I was also relatively new to the field, about 2 years in, and I think one of the things that this model helped me to conceptualize was that when we do, like in policy, when I would meet and do legislative advocacy, I was trained to know my audience. And what was helpful in the way that this framework was structured was that it really crystallized all of the audiences that we work with, right? The students, the faculty, the community partners, the administrators, and then even ourselves. And Lena said something just in this opening framing about the shared identity. And when I think about the ethical commitments and the critical commitments that we all highlighted as the process unfolded, I keep returning to this notion of knowledge of one's own identity, both in how we conceptualize this work that we do, but how we always do it in community with others. And I'm really finding that has been a powerful source of both research as I kind of progress through my own doctoral program, and then also in the way that we're able to work with students, and also in understanding our own identities as CEPs and as individuals, how we are navigating the power dynamics that are always at play when we do this work. And that, I would say, for me, has become very, very salient in recent years. I think the only other piece that I would share, because I remember this really vividly from our meetings, and I was sharing before we kicked off the webinar, that the first email I ever received from Lena in 2015 explained to me how to like clear my cache and install Java so that we could run a GoToMeeting on our computers. And it just reminded me of the pre-pandemic reality where, I mean, I didn't have a webcam. Like, I'm pretty sure I dialed into every single meeting, but it was really powerful to feel that I was learning and connected to these folks who most of whom actually I have not met face to face. Yet Lena, and I think this is a credit to you, formed a really strong sense of community, inquiry, and learning through that process. And so the one last anecdote I'll share is that I remember Sean and I were working on the community partnership chapter, and there was a meeting where we talked about standardizing our language, right? Obviously, we were kind of framing CEPs as a term of art. We talked about how we would refer to it. And then this question came up because everybody was talking about partnerships. Like, how do we refer to community partnerships, right? Because in the literature, we would find university community partnerships, campus community partnerships. And we, as a research team, determined that it was incredibly important to foreground community campus partnerships. And I know, right, there have been past debates in the field about service learning and should it be hyphenated, should it not, is it community service learning? And so this wasn't a particularly long or contentious conversation, but it just really struck me that there was this ethical commitment, right, to centering the community voices and to recognizing community stakeholders as full partners in our collaborative work in knowledge production and trying to bring about social change. We cannot do it without them. And then in something that felt small yet meaningful, to consistently use this terminology of community campus partnerships throughout the whole book. And that is something that I have taken with me through in all of my writing and research. So I will pause it there. Yeah, those are some of my kind of high level reflections on just where we were at the time, and then how the process unfolded as a member of the research team.
So I think, if I'm not mistaken, part of our goal today is to reflect a little bit with one another, just be in conversation together on how the CEP model resonates with our individual trajectories, our scholarship, right? But importantly, to bring out the current moment. I don't know about all of you, but I am tired a lot of the time these days, right? And it's been, as everybody says, right, we're in a critical moment within higher education. And I would posit that since I've been doing this work, we've had a number of these moments, and there were many, many before us. The truth is, for me, I think that folks that occupy these border spanning positions, we notice the moments coming before many others on our campuses do. And we negotiate them from different areas and spaces of practice and affinity, right? Like, that's pretty fancy language. What I really mean by that is I'm connected to enough people that I know when shifts are starting to destabilize how we work together and how they are experiencing their everyday lives in community, on campuses, and in both. And so because of that, as leaders and as community engagement professionals, we're responsive, right? We're responsive. And so there's a little bit of tiredness. There's also a sense of, personally, a little bit of exhilaration, because I feel that, especially throughout the pandemic, the anti-racist uprisings, we've had the opportunity to flex and to deepen some of the work that we get to do. I was sharing with someone recently that on our campus at the University of Pittsburgh, during the height of the pandemic, we actually had returned to basics in many ways, right? Ensuring that people who we were connected with had access to food and shelter and basic healthcare, right? To advocate for people who were experiencing housing insecurity, who needed to access rental rebates. This was a change, right? Because our work has evolved in these fields in such a way that we kind of have like this very sophisticated craft, right? We do engaged scholarship, we do advanced anchor work, and it has a framing to it and a depth to it, but sometimes that moves us away from some of that really crystallized convening and basic needs connections. And that for us was important, that we could do that. And I felt like, because of the relationships that we had, because we have critical commitments, because we do agitate for social change, even through all of those other bodies of practice, that we had the relationships and the partnerships and the networks where we were already at the table and already in the conversation. So it wasn't like we were knocking on doors and trying to say, how are we relevant to you in this moment? It was, this is just the work. Pick up the water and start carrying it, right? And that for me was really powerful. So when I look back at the model and I try to assess, does it hold for me across really sort of sophisticated, kind of formalized bodies of practice? Does it stay consistently applicable for me during height of pandemic, thoughtful sort of basic work? The answer is yeah, for me it does. And a lot of that hinges right on that critical commitments line. I'm curious how Tate and Laura experienced that.
Sure, I'll jump in. Something you're making me think about, Lena, is for our VISTA grant, we are required to report on the performance measures, the outputs and outcomes that pertain to both capacity building and poverty alleviation. And so this really perverse thing happened during the pandemic where we were knocking our benchmarks out of the water, right? Like, we were succeeding in this kind of technocratic work of serving many people. But of course, the realities underlying those outputs was that communities were hurting. And it's reminding me too of the nonlinear nature of this work that we do. And given, that a lot of our work is in, writing grants, reporting on grants, I love logic models. Like, I love to think about the linear progression of our inputs and our activities. And I look at this competency framework as a way to sort of organize all of these domains in which we are having some type of impact. But I think the pandemic also taught me that when progress is nonlinear and when there is indeed like backsliding, which will happen when we are doing the unending work that is trying to move towards justice and democratic practice in higher education, we have to go back to those basics, right? And so I was spending some time just looking at the model and trying to distill, what are those commitments and what are those competencies that have really been a North Star for me. And I think it's the identity piece that I talked about earlier, kind of a sense of one's own identity and how that interfaces with the other partners that we have in this work. Using that then to build relationships, to communicate well along all of these different levels and with all these different stakeholders, taking an asset-based approach, which I think again resonates throughout the dispositions. And then finally, always being conscious of power. And I've also learned, I think, over the years that earlier when I worked on this project, I was much more embroiled in kind of the management and partnering with the students and the faculty and the community partners. And that is very much still a part of my work. But the nice thing about being mid-career, and we also debated what that meant when we were planning this webinar, I think it just means at this point, like that we've been around long enough to see some of that change, right? And so I love this, kind of dialectic, Lena, that you lay out of the exhaustion and the exhilaration, because it's present and it's real. But I think I'm grateful for the longevity, I suppose, of having done this for long enough to know that we can affect change, but to remember too that the change is slow. And just to be thinking about how to, as I build the capital I have, right, on campus and with community partners, how to deploy that in a way that will make a difference, right? How to be strategic and how to use that seat at the table in a way that is ultimately going to result in the greater good.
So at the time that I contributed to this chapter, and then I think the following year with Kira Pasquesi and Lane Perry, we wrote a second chapter, kind of a follow-up using some of the same data. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. But at that time, I was, as I mentioned, a doctoral student at Tulane, and I had been very attracted to Tulane because of its commitment to place. Now, I have some colleagues who are at the Center for Public Service on the call today, and they will be the first to tell you that that's very complicated. But I really enjoyed those conversations with the colleagues that are on today and others along the 5 years that I was at Tulane, just wrestling through critical commitments and the relationship between university and community. And when I was at Tulane, I also worked at the Center for Public Service. So I did research and evaluation. And in a lot of ways, it was really a precursor to what I do now. We've already talked about logic models. So thank you, Laura, for teeing that up. But I did a lot of support of programs that were a part of the Center for Public Service, which is a really robust hub for community engagement at Tulane. And I, helped them build logic models and talked about data, and we wrote a lot of surveys. And then I left, and after I finished my PhD, instead of staying in the academy, I left the academy and I worked for a while as the director of research at a mid-sized evaluation consulting firm. And this year I started my own thing, the Evaluation Coach, which is all about supporting program level teams to identify why data matters, find out their outcomes, measure them, and learn to tell the story of their data. So I say all that to say, there's a real thread throughout my career of the community engagement professional, but it's interesting to reflect on it now as someone who's a support role for community engagement professionals. One of the programs that I'm working right now is the Mettle program at Tulane, which is really deeply rooted. It's a a graduate level program that's deeply rooted in the critical commitment piece of this. So it all comes back around for sure. But as I said, I am outside of the academy looking in, helping to support staff, which I absolutely really enjoy. The two things for me, Lena's question is what holds, does it hold? And again, I have a different lens on it than if I was still working inside of the academy. But there are two things that really stick with me. One is broadly about competency models. So I think a lot these days about developing a learning culture within a program team. And this idea of having, wrestling through a list of attributes, skills, attitudes, and critical commitments that really enhance a team that's doing this work. I think really provides an opportunity. The words that Lena wrote in the book were a roadmap of continual learning and development. So that's one way of using a competency model. And I'd be curious if anyone wants to put in the chat if you've used it in that way, if your team has looked at the competency model and thought through, either as an individual or as a team, where it is you might like to further develop your own learning and being a learning oriented organization. So I really valued that again, I said earlier, just finding the people in the work, valuing the wisdom of staff and the experience of staff, and them knowing what they need to work on and learn together in a competency model. And then the second thing that has really stuck out to me is, so in the chapter that we wrote, we thought a lot about career development theory. So the chapter was about long-term career objectives of community engagement professionals. So that might be where a lot of those on the call today are wrestling. And then also the factors that motivate them. So what is out there with career development theory that can inform where we all think we're going when it comes to our long-term career objectives? And a few things I thought that you all might find relevant in your own life. There were some spectrums that we looked at. So one is values oriented. So when you talk about the future of your own career objectives, are you talking about wanting to change the university or wanting to make an impact in your local community? Is there a values orientation that you have? I thought that was really interesting. And then another was this concept of boundarylessness. And, you know, there's different ways of thinking about that. I would say perhaps of most of those on the call, I probably at this moment in my career have a lot more boundarylessness, meaning not being associated directly with a larger organization or institution. But there's also this whole perspective of being kind of in a hybrid role within the university. And I was always very attracted to that with the community engagement professional, that a lot of people play hybrid positions. And I think boundary spanning is the language that Lena used a second ago. And then there was one other that I thought was interesting, which is local versus national. So where are your networks? Where are your commitments? We don't often talk about the family and other aspects to why we make long-term career objectives. But for me, for example, I have always been very attracted to place-based work, but I am, you know, my spouse has a job that moves us around, and, you know, we moved from New Orleans to DC. And so that's very much informed my interest in remote work, which is not really community engaged work. You know, it limits in a different way. I'm sure there are lots on the call that are very dedicated to their place and their networks in place. And so that's also, you know, a big motivation when it comes to career objectives. So those are just a few of the things that when I was reading back across this really stood out to me.
Thank you, Lena, Tate, and Laura. I did want to emphasize Tate's question. Feel free to add in the chat the question on how does the competency model resonate with you right now in your professional and I meant to write personal trajectories. Thank you, Tate, for that question. It would be great if you all can add that. I'm just reminding ourselves, this is a two-part webinar. And the title today was Testing Our Mettle, Part 1 for mid-career community engagement professionals. Although if you feel like you're outside that mid-career timeline, which I'm sure is a very complicated algorithm, you can discount COVID to get you back in within probably that 5 to 10 years. And the session will guide community engagement professionals through a process of reorienting our relationships to our professional roles and reviving our motivation to act as change agents. And many of you and many of our colleagues have really touched on this idea of you know, the social and emotional toll that the last couple of years, and sometimes it's Lena, where we name it and then we kind of do our personal work around that, and then we kind of default to some of the things that we had to do to kind of hold things together. If you're okay with it, it would be great if maybe the three of you wouldn't mind sharing some reactions to a couple of prompts. And then I'll also look at the questions and kind of lift up and kind of make sure that some of our participant questions make it your way as well. Here are a couple prompts that I have, especially around this idea of weariness, and exhaustion. It's like, I'm looking at the competencies, and do you think that is there something around the social and emotional competencies that you would add in here looking back at it? I mean, it's somewhat embedded in some of the questions, like, for example, humility and how you would approach some dispositions that are kind of intertwined commitments. I'm just wondering, since this was 2017, anything 5 years ago, you could lump as 10 years ago, really, at this point. But I'm curious as to see if there's anything around these social and emotional dispositions that you would want to emphasize.
I'll jump in here. Chris, you're breaking up a little bit for me, so I hope that that's not on my end. I will just fill. I will just fill in. So I'm going to connect I'm going to connect your question about maybe anything to amplify in the social emotional realm of competencies with a question I saw coming through the chat about community organizing. And, it's been several years since we worked on this, obviously. And when I was thinking about it, I was like, I hope that Sean and I remembered to put in conflict, because I think as I have advanced in my career, I find myself frequently, needing to resolve conflict. And my coworkers, on this call have heard me say this. I have found that conversations that I think will be difficult are never that hard when they are grounded in the mutual regard and trust that we have built over time with our colleagues, be them faculty, colleagues, students, community partners. And so I remind myself, right, that maybe it is as simple as nurturing those relationships and being authentic, but then to connect it to the community organizing question in the chat, this is by no means kind of a theoretical framework that we practice, but one of my family members is a lifelong community organizer, and we were speaking over the summer, and I was sharing about a difficult conversation that I needed to have with some local officials around affordable housing. So Lena, it's really interesting to hear that housing security has been amplified for you all in the wake of the pandemic. It is absolutely an issue that we are navigating here locally in Oxford, Mississippi, and Lafayette County. And this lifelong organizer was like, here's the thing. I always tell people, we all want to be liked. It is more important to be respected. You may have difficult conversations. And I would say, again, if we ground those in mutual regard with the end goal of coming away that you may not agree, but the other person, whether or not they like you, respects where you're coming from, right? And so I would say, again, the how is in that authenticity and that integrity and that reflection that are in the model. I know the reflective piece, we also wrote about in the book how time feels very scarce, and this feeds into the exhaustion piece, right? The sense that there is not always enough time to do the deep reflection to get us to that place of praxis. But I would say, that has been a transformative way of thinking for me about how to retain my integrity and be true to my principles while I tackle these issues that are incredibly high stakes, where I may not walk away with being liked, but at the very least, I know that I want to be respected, and try to instill that as a training piece for some of the students that I work with.
I love that point about conflict. I think that's so valuable, Laura. And I was going to go in a different direction, which was Chris's point about wellness. And I know that certainly the community engagement program that I'm supporting with data coaching is, again, it's focused, Mellon program focused on graduate students. And I can't speak to whether this started after the pandemic or before, but in recent years, they've actually added a counselor who's been part of trainings and conversations with students, or really with the community, because it's community leaders, faculty leaders, and graduate student leaders coming together, creating community engagement projects. And this counselor speaks to the humanity and also spiritual wellness for the graduate students and others that participate. And just in the early data, that aspect of humanity and wellness has been something that's the most meaningful for participants. So I do think that's new in how we're talking about things. And also, thank goodness, let's talk about our humanness in this work and how it impacts our relationships and our ability to have other competencies. It's all very much connected. So I am excited to think about that being an addition to the competency model.
When we were working on this model, and by the way, folks in the chat have asked for the competency model to be reposted in the chat. It is. There's a couple of times where the PDF has come up. When we were working on this, I was at a very different kind of institution than I am now. And our community engagement center was a sort of very centralized kind of convening space. And it felt like it held a lot of the gravity around the work that happened with our communities, on our campus, off our campus, et cetera. The place that I am now, very similar in the sense that we have a centralized role. Interestingly, I'm part of our senior leadership team here at the university. So there is that sense of agenda setting and centralization. But at a place the size of this, and at some of your institutions, those of you that have joined us today, I mean, these are immense institutions, there's a distributedness in who has pieces of the work. And that doesn't just encapsulate on a campus, right? It includes the geographies that we're in and the partner networks that we're in. So I was reflecting on the dispositions as well. And those that rose up for me personally today in this moment were around perseverance and patience. I think there's in one dimension of the competency model, we wrote respect for community perspectives, but actually today I would probably broaden that out as the ability to have perspective or to take perspective taking, if you would. There's a sense now that I've got, based on where I am institutionally, that there's me and mine are not responsible for everything, but we can cheerlead and we can advocate and we can agitate. We can strategically enable, we can identify, we can elevate and celebrate, right? Those are a lot of words, but what that means is we're acting in these ways that are the go-betweens, right? And that for me is a bit freeing, but it also means that there's patience in that. So that's some piece of this that's relevant for me. The other piece that seems to be on my mind these days is just the instrumentality of how we take on the institution alongside of our work, right? I mean, like we can't divorce ourselves from these places. We are a part of it. And certainly as a leader at my institution, I am a part of it. And that has been tremendously humbling for me. I think there was a point in my career where I could somehow sideline that, I could set apart from. And that is not true of my role today. And that means that I have a burdensome responsibility of positive progress, right? So I lean back on this model a lot to get me back to basics. And it's there, it's all in there, right? It's all in there. It's like, but I think there are always ways that this thing can be tested and stretched. And one of those in particular is around calling out what it means to do really deep place-based work and the blurred memberships that we have there. I think that was not fully explored in the original model. I think it was revisited in that special issue of the Journal of Higher Ed Outreach and Engagement. But I think more work there could be done in a really interesting way. I also think anchor work could be added in here in a really meaningful way. So there's room, right? This is not by any means complete.
Thank you, three. And again, my apologies if my my internet's chopping in and out. So I'll do my best here. Really appreciating your insights and seeing the questions fill out a little bit. And this question / statement really resonates for me, given what the three of you just reflected on, and may transition us into some broader questions and discussion points. But I really want to activate the collective expertise and wisdom here So both in terms of asking questions and maybe responding to some of these questions, I believe everything will be recorded, and there's just a lot of rich experience, ideas, insights that are being shared on the chat as well. So we want to make sure we capture all of this. The prompt here from Julia, Julia writes, does anyone else suffer from organizational whiplash? I've had 3 directors in 4 years, and I am at a loss to continually reinvent myself based upon each new director. These competencies will very much help me in my conversations. And then I kind of sense in that statement that by saying that, it's a way to strengthen some resolve around having to encapsulate some of these competencies and dispositions moving forward. So just would love to hear your reflections on Julia's note there. And then please, anyone else, feel free to add on the chat.
And I'm happy to expand on anything too.
Please do.
So I come from a land grant institution in Connecticut. Been the director of service learning for many years. I started it at the university in 2007 as a graduate student. So I've been around for a bit, but the university, as all of you, I'm sure, have gone through in your own way, never really knows what to do with service learning. And we did have public engagement as a formalized office starting in 2010. And I've just experienced several directors and iterations, you know, depending on the provost that gets hired. And I've always been on the academic side. But anyway, I just feel that I'm constantly pushing a boulder up a mountain. What I mean by that is, so the Office of Public Engagement that I was in previously was closed in 2018. I went over to another unit. And now we have reopened the Office of Public Engagement. It's Outreach and Engagement now. And this is great news. It's just been challenging having 3 different personalities, 3 different types of individuals running the ship. And I'm happy to do this, but I just feel like every time I do it, my programs get taken away. I have to fight for them. I have to just constantly fight for what I know to be right as it relates to the philosophy of service learning. You know, I always go back to, ethically, what does this do to my community partners? What does this do, to the faculty that I've been working with? What does it do to the community partners that have been giving me money over the past several years? There's all these challenges that I wish it weren't so difficult. So I don't know if anybody has any similar stories or, anything. I just would love to hear about any other war stories.
Julia, you're not alone. I'm looking in the chat, right? We heard from somebody else. They've moved 3 divisions, changed their names 4 times. Look, I don't want to be glib about this, but the change is inevitable.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear what Tate and Laura have to say about this. I'll offer just one thing quickly. I'm drawn to my history. I'm drawn to know who my people are and what my histories are and what the history of my institution is in its place. And so we did that here at the University of Pittsburgh. We were launching these community engagement centers back in 2017. And it was so important for me that I did 2 things. I understood the history of my institution in that neighborhood setting over time, and that I could understand the history of engagement at the University of Pittsburgh. Because there was a duality, right? There was a sense of invalidation for people who had done this work deeply over many, many, many years, some decades. But now there was this new big shiny institutional strategic initiative happening, right? Conversely, in our communities, there was history, right? There were harms, there were misunderstandings about how could some of you from that institution be so authentic and great and some not, like, how does this all work? So anyway, history was so important to me, and drawing that out gave me a lot of perspective. It gave me the opportunity to reflect on how over many years at this institution, things have gone by different names. They've been shepherded by different people. There have been different sets of resources or lack of resources, but there's a through line to it, right? And finding that through line was really critical for me, because then it became my job to talk about the through line and explain why the work mattered, why this particular orientation to the work really mattered. And my team and I, some of whom who are on the webinar today, we spend a good amount of our time talking about how do we do this work, right? How is so important for us, not the name of it, not the specific activity set. It's how, like, what's the qualities of that work? And that I found a bit sheltering, particularly when there is a little bit of that whiplash. And I'm sure everybody here has experienced some reshuffling on the teams. I know I have, to a very high degree, and that's really tough, right? Whether it's the leader that's changing or some of the folks on the team, this is all work that's based on people, right? You can never take the people out of the institution. And often we refer to things like the institution does this. It's all people. So it's incredibly unsettling when you've got lots and lots of changes in those people. So I think look for the through lines and look for the quality of the work. Tate, Laura?
I'm sitting here smiling because this is all I know of higher education, for what it's worth. And since I have joined the University of Mississippi in 2013, we have had 3 chancellors, 2 interim chancellors, requisite shifts in provosts, deans, department chairs. We are also housed in academic affairs. We have moved, we have changed, we've had 4 names. So, I mean, this is all I know. And it was very reassuring to me in my doctoral program to learn that universities, there is an organizational model, which is basically sort of loosely structured anarchy, right? And we joke about this, but I think it is very, very parallel to the ambiguity and the uncertainty that we deal with in communities. I mean, I think where we have been very successful, and I would maybe even wonder fortunate or lucky to anchor our work, has been in the strategic plans. I work at the University of Mississippi. We are a public research university. We identify ourselves as the flagship university. So since I happen to work at an institute whose mission is to transform lives and fight poverty through education, innovation, and entrepreneurship, we're always relevant, right? I think we are always the good news. That doesn't mean that our path has been straightforward. Again, very nonlinear, but I would say, honestly, like, one thing that has given me solace is just remembering that we are not alone in charting this winding road. And one thing which I said earlier that has been such a gift of the pandemic is actually finding my way to networks and associations like these, where I'm able to interface with colleagues and learn that their struggles are very similar to ours, and learn how they have gone about socializing messages about their work, and learn how they have essentially, pitched, like, again, my legislative training, right? Like, you're basically building a coalition around the public purpose of higher education. And I see that unfolding both through institutional change, but then also in the communities. And I think, there has been turnover at the partner organizations with which we work most closely. I've seen a lot more turnover during the pandemic, but I would say a lot of the stability that we have found has come through our partnerships. And I think Lena is speaking to that in terms of what does it mean to be place-based? We are rural, right? And so we struggle too with, we work in the immediate community where we are located. We also work as far as 1-2 hours outside of campus. But there are very stable individuals and organizations that have just become kind of our partners in this work over the long haul. And I would say, when there is instability on campus, I try to find the balance, right? Like sitting at that fulcrum. And so one way that we've weathered the storms is to really just, again, go back to the basics, return to those relationships with our partners, and try to build up their capacity so that we can have a little more certainty as we move forward together. But you are not alone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think it's so valuable, Julia, to make space for the constant change in higher education and how challenging that is. You know, to me, this is a space that you all can celebrate consistency. A lot of you have been at your institutions a long time and in this space a long time, and that is really unvalued, you know, not lifted up enough in higher education, where there's so much turnover. It's something that we again wrote about in this article that was about factors that motivate long-term career objectives, is that in some fields there's this real push to move and go to different institutions in order to move up. And this is a place-based field where we really want to build, you know, community and partnerships over time. So that takes a lot of persistence, as a word that came up. I also heard from Laura and Lena a few other competencies that we need to add. So know your history. I mean, how valuable is that advice? Also articulate how you do the work. I actually wrote why at first and I crossed it out because that's not how Lena said it, but it's a valuable point of switching from the why to the how, really knowing both and being able to say that. Embracing uncertainty, which doesn't seem like enough, you know, strong enough, but Julia, that's what you're wrestling through. And another one I wanted to add was being asset based. So Laura works in Mississippi, where I have done a lot of work as well, and rural areas, another space where especially rural Mississippi, done a lot of work. And there's been a small move to really be more intentionally asset based about these communities. And I find it to be such a valuable and powerful tool. So that's what made me think of it, Laura, you just talking about the rural nature of your work. But I think no matter where we are, bringing an asset-based language and you know, way of talking about our communities and the wisdom of our partners is another way of thinking through this. And then I'm going to throw out my nerdy perspective here and say data is another way you could approach this. So you know, the idea of participatory evaluation, meaning coming together to figure out what type of change are we trying to create with this work. That's a very small, you know, sentence, but it's very powerful if you really bring different stakeholders, community stakeholders, student stakeholders, faculty together around asking yourself that question. And then you know, the theory of change approach is to operationalize those outcomes, which could be qualitative, it could be quantitative. There's different ways to think through it, but how can we really come together to agree on what we're trying to do and then see over time with data how that is really emerging. And these are hard things to measure. I mean, certainly that's why doing evaluation and research and community engagement work is so exciting and interesting, because it's complex. But coming together around goals and figuring out how to track it over time is my nerdy lens, my on-brand response. So.
Hey, way to get into the t-shirt slogan contest. You know, Lena was leading the way with our work is a thing. Laura came in with loosely structured anarchy. I just need to unpack it during a happy hour. And then data is a thing. So we're doing well there. I do want to move us into some questions from the audience that I think transition this. But Julia, I'll just quickly add, you know, let's name the fact that the last couple of years, lots of people have reprioritized. And so it, you know, the great resignation, as I've experienced and what I know many of us have experienced, not necessarily resigning for bad things, but for people just kind of saying, you know, I'm going to do something else. And so for whatever reason, our colleagues and friends have moved on. It's caused significant amount of strain. I think maybe it was Lena or Laura talking about institutional memory. When you lose, I mean, we so deeply value our colleagues who are kind of part of the fabric of this work, and we value the fact that reciprocity has to be embodied by how we're received by colleagues and our stakeholders. And when we lose that kind of memory and connectivity, it just you know, it's super challenging. So I just wanted to make sure that, you know, in this idea of that we're in this kind of together. I've been hearing from colleagues that that's how this this time of capacity and people moving on has been affecting us. So
That's
I'm going
great.
to go.
Thank you.
There's a question. Have you found higher education HR departments, community engagement centers making use of the competency model in devising job descriptions and or performance evaluations.
So early when I was starting to build out the community engagement centers at the University of Pittsburgh and we were hiring in for our directors, I used quite a bit of the skills pieces within our job descriptions. I've been, and to some degree in others, I've been contacted numerous times though by people asking if we've got JD banks, right? People are wanting to know if based on that work, we got a lot of job descriptions. And the answer, just in case anybody's wondering, no, we don't have banks of job descriptions, although I understand why that would be super useful and helpful. But the other part of that for me is some of this, again, we have to be thoughtful that this is a huge body of knowledge, skill, disposition, and critical commitment, right? That for many of us, this is more about development and iterative development and deepening the commitments to the work and kind of refining how we get there. And so I think there's some usefulness of particularly around the skills, maybe around some of the basic pieces of knowledge, but some of this needs to be put into the framework of ongoing professional development and thoughtfulness around how we're developing over time, right? Which is important.
I like this question, and it is not something that I can say I have been involved with at the University of Mississippi. I will say that here's a distinction too, and I see Aaliyah in the chat is talking about the balance between the tenure clock and the principles of high quality community engaged work. So I'm in a staff position, right? So we have the faculty activity reports on campus, obviously for our faculty colleagues, and we do staff appraisals for staff members. And in recent years, the university created a staff appraisal. And when we were doing the Carnegie process, I was trying to figure out like why some of the stuff I was doing wasn't showing up in the big database, right? That institutional research had access to. And it's because I'm not a faculty member. So some of my conference presentations or publications like this, for example, it didn't end up in our Carnegie application until I was like, wait a minute, I did something that could be relevant to our overall application, right? And so one thing, and actually how this webinar came about was a group of us on the special planning committee, and Star, I hope you don't mind me, talking about this, was essentially debriefing and realizing there are not rewards in many cases for people in staff positions that try to have a scholarly life as practitioner scholars. And I know that many of us have kind of therefore taken on multiple identities of being, and this speaks to the blurred lines, Lena, that you were talking about, simultaneously staff/administrators, also students, also members of the community, and we're speaking to wellness and burnout, also caregivers in our families, so I think there are so many roles that stack. Something that I'm thinking about that, once I defended my dissertation and had this moment of being like, I'm still the same person I was like a couple months ago, right? Like, I feel like I still hold all of this. My resume literally looks very similar. I'm incredibly proud that I did it. And in fairness, I think the accountability piece of having a structured program got me through. But with that said, when I went back to the model and was thinking about pushing for change and recognizing the inequities that our institutions perpetuate, sometimes that our work perpetuates, if there isn't a procurement policy for compensating a community partner, how can I use, my knowledge of the institution and my ethical values to find a way. I feel very vulnerable as a staff member in trying to push for institutional change, more so than I imagine I would if I had a faculty affiliation. And so I think, we have not institutionalized this in HR. My, sort of backdoor way has been faculty allies. Our director is a full professor. What an amazing champion and a voice for the tenure and promotion conversations that we're having on campus. But I'm also realizing that as a staff member, as a community engagement professional, I too can play a role in contextualizing why this transdisciplinary work is important and getting us again to fulfill the public purpose of this institution. But my final thought on this is that I think I have felt called to be engaged at the policy level. That was my background before coming to higher ed. It feels urgent now, kind of bringing out the urgency of this moment coming through the pandemic. And so what I am trying to do is anchor my work as a practitioner scholar in the institutional change, in the place-based change, because that at least gives me the security of research. The people in power understand that research is valid if it's being produced by somebody who works at the university. And so I haven't formalized it through HR. I am trying to somehow thread the needle between what I know is right, or what I believe to be right and just, and how to validate that within my role as a staff member and all those other roles that I rattled off before.
Thank you.
I'm conscientious. I want to give about 10 more minutes for this discussion and some of the questions. So we'll try to get through a couple, but here's one that has come up several times. How can we leverage our power nationally to make the changes that we know we need in higher education? And to Laura, Tate, Lena, would it be also okay if a participant is just clamoring to share their reflection on that? They could jump in as well. Awesome.
I'll offer a thought here, and that is, well, there's really two things that I've done recently that kind of moved in this direction. One of those was that as we were navigating very hyper-local place-based engagements at the neighborhood scale, we were identifying others across the country who were doing similar things, maybe some who had been doing them for longer, and benchmarking the ways in which that occurred, what those kinds of what the ethical conduct was around that, where were the attention points, and pulling that together in a way that made it much more visible than just sort of exceptional institutional examples, right? I felt like that was something that I was noticing as we were moving into that work, that there was the sense of like, well, right, I mean, you know, Chris does that, but that's Chris's shop, and that's so singular and unique. And I agree that Chris's work is unique, right? But also there's a level of innovation, and I would say depth of authentic engagement that Chris and his team have achieved that we are also endeavoring to achieve. And being able to pull models from other places in a way that makes visible what's shared in common was really useful for us. So that's one way that I've done that. Another way that I've done that is in connecting to other institutions where their community affairs, community relations work is nested alongside of or in the same units as the community engaged work. That's very rare. We don't see it a ton, but that is the case at our institution by choice. We felt it very important to be able to put these things together. Alternatively, we felt like the community engaged ideals and aspirations could be undercut or somehow endangered by the community affairs function at the institution. We wanted those things to live side by side. However, it's again about pulling together across the country and raising up sort of standards of practice that nobody else is going to articulate for us. And it's really hard to say to somebody, this is our standard of practice without an external validation that exists somewhere else. So for me, it's standard of practice as it relates to principled practice is a way that we exert pressure back onto the institution.
Thank you, Lena. Tate, given what your organization is doing, I'm wondering, it seems like you're uniquely positioned as somebody who's an evaluator and consultant, you know, helping organizations kind of share their story and have some influence in the field. Would you mind responding to this question as well?
I love the way you just framed that, Chris. And I really enjoyed hearing Lena talk about, so my brain was going in a different direction. So I'm so sorry for not bringing it back, but I'll think about your question for just a second.
Please.
Lena has mentioned several times the idea of anchor institutions. And that's a topic I really was fascinated by when I was studying this, but it hadn't been written about much, especially for Julia and Lena, who are at well, I don't know if that Pitt's a land grant institution, but very much a local locally oriented place. I am very curious about how the idea of anchor institutions is one answer to this question. Lena, did you have anything that you were thinking about when you said anchor institutions being an addition to this earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's different notions of anchor work, right? There's the sort of notion of concretizing more locally one's buy, build, and hire. There's the notion of accelerating economic opportunities within a larger rubric of buy, build, and hire. So let me give an example of what I'm talking about. We're actively trying to expand the numbers of dollars that we spend locally, whether that is through hiring practices, procurement practices, construction practices, et cetera. But it's a second tier set of work that needs to happen. One might even call it like second order change work around, as an example, how do we work with contract employees for which there is both high turnover and a high incidence of previous criminal offense, to expunge records and make more portable and employable those folks even after they've left our institution, because we know that it impacts them in the long term, right? So that's kind of the set of anchor works that I'm really interested in. And I think there's a number of competencies that go along with that, which is about the ability to, within what is a fairly institutionalized set of programs, understand deeply where are the levers that you push to make that very real and a pathway of opportunity for individuals that are affected deeply by some level of economic marginalization, right? So there's a competency there, and probably not being terribly eloquent about what that is, but I think we need to expand the models and think in those ways. There's something about the ability to stand in the middle of the work in a programmatized setting and say, yes, but also we have to be doing this, this, and this in order to uphold some equity principles within it.
I love that, Lena. That was where I was headed in my thoughts with what Chris asked me as well, and that there are points here when it comes to our critical commitments that are levers, as you just put it, that we can measure, right? So if we have a theory of change, both as an institution and as a community, all these institutions together, or maybe at least certain types of institutions, if you're thinking through what type of change you want to see happen, there's some really interesting things that we could measure, which I would be really nerdy to think through. But for example, where are we spending our money? Are we spending it locally? Who are we hiring? Some of the things that Lena just mentioned make me think of doing something where it's taking a step back and thinking through what type of change are we trying to actually accomplish, talking about that as a community, and then thinking about what levers might be measured at different levels of this, system. So, Chris, that was my first thought with your question. Laura, was there anything you would add?
You guys are making me think about, the question about national change is one that I'm happy we've kind of landed back on this place-based hyperlocal anchor conversation, because when I worked in Texas, when I was doing legislative advocacy there, I really had this thought that if my work isn't impacting 25 million people, then I'm just not interested, right? Which is preposterous, because then I moved to a state with a population of about 3 million. And I think then it was during the pandemic when I was having my partners, mayors of communities, in the Mississippi Delta, North Mississippi, with populations of 8,000 or 1,200, making decisions, right, to impose a curfew or require masks. I think in my trajectory, I've really come around to this idea that, we can effect change most effectively at the local level. And I think that we can do that, particularly for those of us engaged in place-based work, by leveraging those multiple identities that so many of our faculty, staff, and students hold. In some of my research, working with groups of students that are a part of the Grisham McLean Institute, it was fascinating to hear them talk about this strong sense of identification with the city of Oxford for the time that they're here. And so I know that there was a question in the chat about training students in organizing. And we have a really strong program called Catalyzing Entrepreneurship and Economic Development, where we train students to partner with community-based organizations working to improve quality of life in Mississippi. But something else that I think connects to an earlier thread was, we can, as staff without the benefit of tenure, we can be very secure in our work when it is anchored in scholarship. I think we can also be secure in this sort of insurgency or advocacy that we do with institutions when we work with students, right? When we train students with the tools so that they can then go out and affect change. And I think that particularly when students hold this identification as residents of the community where our institutions are located, or residents of the state and have a flagship affinity, I think we can really kind of build that collective power. So honestly, during the pandemic, my thinking has had far less to do with national shifts, just simply because of where we are. And I have really kind of honed into how can we hold influence and bring about change at the local level.
Hi, everyone. I'm back. My apologies, but I caught most of what Tate, Lena, and Laura had said. Other byproducts of this time is no weariness at all as it comes to technology. But, and as suspected, very rich conversation. I'm glad that the Special Programming Committee was wise enough to ensure that this was a two-part dialogue. And, you know, there was just a lot to share here and consider. So thank you so much to Lena, Tate, and Laura for your time and wisdom. We know that this is a labor of love, and this is not just our scholarly work, but really our practice that we're all trying to embody. And deep appreciation for what you have contributed and what you can continue to contribute as well. Thank you to our Special Programming Committee for putting this together and for ensuring that we are serving our colleagues in the field. Especially during this time, it's so critical to make sure we're sharing this kind of knowledge and creating this community of practice. And a special shout out to Dr. Star Plaxton Moore for, while you see her behind the scenes, you all know how much of a brilliant scholar and practitioner she is. And having the wisdom to bring this together has been so instrumental. So here is a slide for part 2. Star, is it October 3rd or the 5th? Because some people have it as the 5th.
I can maybe hop in. It is the 3rd, but on our website it is listed.
Okay, it is the 3rd. Okay. Thank
yeah,
you, Susan.
mistaken.
Wonderful. Excellent. Well, thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your week. And I think there was a conversation about anchor institutions. If you want to learn more, we are happy to host the Coalition for Urban and Metropolitan Universities Conference. I know many of you are attending in San Diego in a few short weeks. We're getting into our winter, so it is about 74 degrees, so you'll want to bring a scarf. But we hope to see you soon. Take good care, everyone.